This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Officials met in Qatar today for new ceasefire talks on the war in the Gaza Strip. Residents in Gaza are hoping for an end to the war, while families of hostages are longing for their loved ones to return home. NTD's Jason Perry has the story.
Families of hostages made their voices heard in Tel Aviv on Thursday as officials met in Qatar for new ceasefire talks that could possibly release the hostages.
We know there's a summit today. We put very little hopes on the Israeli delegation's seriousness to sign the deal, and we call upon the nations of the world, help us get this situation remediated.
There are currently about 110 hostages believed to be in the Gaza Strip, and Israeli authorities believe about a third of them are deceased. Meanwhile, residents in the Gaza Strip are also hoping that a ceasefire deal will be reached in this latest round of talks.
Let them accept the deal and end this. Find a solution for us. Look, women are in the street. They cannot find food or sleep. They are begging in the streets.
I am a displaced woman living in a tent. We are exhausted. One of my sons was killed and the other is missing.
Also on Thursday, White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby explained what these latest ceasefire talks are focused on.
We are now talking about the implementing details of the deal itself, the smaller gaps that we absolutely believe can be narrowed in terms of how the deal is executed. It's not about a debate in Doha today about the deal itself, the structure of it. It's now about implementing. And sometimes, you know, when you get to the end of a negotiation and you're talking about those kinds of details, that's when it gets the hardest and the most gritty. So hopefully we'll make some progress here in the coming hours and days.
And in the meantime, the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF, plan to keep the pressure on Hamas.
Hamas should know that every day they hold our hostages, it will be more bitter for them than the day before. We will make it worse until we manage to return the hostages. And after that, we will not allow Hamas to even raise its head.
Israel's chief of staff was visiting troops at the Philadelphia corridor, which runs along the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And the IDF has destroyed about 50 tunnels there in the past week. Israeli forces say Hamas used those tunnels to smuggle weapons that were later used against Israeli troops and civilians. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Ukraine now has a military commandant's office in the occupied area of Russia. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is preparing to beef up border security to avoid further losses. Here's the latest on Ukraine's offensive.
Russian state television recently aired this footage highlighting the aftermath of Ukraine's attack on Kursk. The video shows cars, military vehicles, and homes that were destroyed. Ukraine's top commander on Thursday said that Ukraine has set up a commander's office in the occupied part of Russia's Kursk region. He said that Ukrainian forces are still advancing and have moved forward almost a mile in the last 24 hours. The commander told President Volodymyr Zelensky that Kyiv's forces had advanced over 20 miles into the Kursk region so far. The Pentagon said that Russia is redeploying assets in response to the incursion.
So we have seen some Russian units be redirected from operations in Ukraine towards the Kursk area. These are just early reports, so I can't really say with certainty the numbers or, their objectives, but we have seen some movement.
Russia's defense minister said that commanders have prepared a series of actions to increase security in border regions.
We are talking, first of all, about increasing the efficiency of the troop command and control system in interaction with other law enforcement agencies and the administration of the Belgorod region.
Ukraine's presence in the area could increase as well. On Thursday, the UK said that Ukrainian forces could use British tanks and weapons in Russian territory. Ukraine is asking the U.S. for authorization to use long-range missiles to strike deeper into Russia, which could accelerate the offensive. Here's what the State Department said about the request.
There has been no change to United States policy when it comes to cross-border attacks. What we're focused on is making sure that our Ukrainian partners have what they need to defend themselves from Russian aggression.
Russia declared a federal-level state of emergency in the Belgorod region, which is next to Kursk. Meanwhile, regional authorities have ordered the evacuation of thousands of residents from Kursk. In total, almost 200,000 people have been evacuated so far.
A hurricane warning in effect for Bermuda. Hurricane Ernesto is expected to pass near or over the island on Saturday. Health concerns in Puerto Rico as hundreds of thousands of people were left without power or water, while temperatures hit the high 80s and low 90s. There's also a risk of dangerous currents along the east coast of the U.S. NTD's David Lamb reports.
Hurricane Ernesto on Thursday barreled toward Bermuda, where it promised to produce dangerous storm surge and heavy rains after around 470,000 Puerto Rico homes and businesses were without power in its wake. The Federal Aviation Administration says Ernesto is affecting flights and could cause delays in Minneapolis, Chicago, Boston, and the central Gulf Coast. The Category 1 hurricane was 600 miles southwest of Bermuda as it crawled north, packing winds of 85 miles an hour on Thursday, according to the National Hurricane Center. Ernesto is to approach Bermuda on Saturday, where it could produce prolonged strong winds, flash flooding, and dangerous storm surge. The agency said there's high risks of dangerous rip currents along beaches on the U.S. East Coast. Ernesto became a hurricane on Wednesday and is the fifth named Atlantic storm of the hurricane season. Hurricane Beryl, the first of the season, was the earliest Category 5 storm on record in the Atlantic when it swept through the Caribbean and the Texas Gulf Coast last month. David Lamb, NTD News.
Charges have been filed against individuals connected to the death of actor Matthew Perry, including his personal assistant and 2 doctors. NTD's Christina Corona reports from Los Angeles with more details.
We're here outside of the LA Superior Courthouse in downtown Los Angeles, where attorneys announced 5 people have been charged in connection with the death of the Friends star Matthew Perry.
The U.S. Attorney's Office announced on Thursday that those arrested included Perry's live-in personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and a drug supplier known as the Ketamine Queen. The 2 lead defendants were identified as Jasvine Sanya and Dr. Salvador Plasencia.
Defendant Plasencia was a medical doctor. He worked with another medical doctor, defendant Mark Chavez, to obtain ketamine. He then worked with Mr. Perry's live-in assistant, defendant Kenneth Iwamasa, to distribute that ketamine to Mr. Perry.
Over 2 months, from September to October 2023, they distributed approximately 20 vials of ketamine to Mr. Perry in exchange for $55,000 in cash.
Estrada says defendant Plasencia saw this as an opportunity to profit off of the actor Perry.
He wrote in a text message in September 2023, quote, "I wonder how much this moron will pay."
The other lead defendant, Jasvine Sanya, allegedly sold 50 vials of ketamine to Perry for $11,000 in cash over 2 weeks, collaborating with Eric Fleming and Kenneth Iwamasa to distribute the drugs.
Defendant Sanya sold the batch of ketamine that resulted in Mr. Perry's death on October 28.
4 days later, the actor was found unresponsive in his Pacific Palisades hot tub. The LA County Medical Examiner ruled his death was due to the acute effects of ketamine. Officers later searched defendant Sanya's home.
They found 80 vials of ketamine, thousands of pills containing methamphetamine, cocaine, bottles of Xanax and other illegally obtained prescription drugs, and drug-selling paraphernalia.
The DEA administrator pointed out that those involved in selling ketamine to the star viewed Matthew Perry merely as a payday.
They supplied Matthew Perry with large amounts of ketamine in exchange for large sums of money, charging Perry $2,000 for a vial that cost Dr. Chavez approximately $12.
Sonia and Placentia face conspiracy charges for distributing ketamine. Sonia, 41, also faces charges for maintaining a drug-involved premises, possession with intent to distribute methamphetamine and ketamine, and 5 counts of ketamine distribution. Placentia is charged with 7 counts of ketamine distribution and 2 counts of falsifying records. Eric Fleming, 54, of Hawthorne, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and ketamine distribution resulting in death. Kenneth Iwamasa, 59, conspired to distribute ketamine with Sonia, Fleming, and Placentia. And Dr. Mark Chavez, 54, of San Diego, agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy, admitting he sold ketamine to Placentia, including doses diverted from his former clinic.
These defendants took advantage of Mr. Perry's addiction issues to enrich themselves. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew what they were doing was risking great danger to Mr. Perry, but they did it anyways.
The autopsy report noted trace amounts of ketamine were found in his stomach contents, and it was reported that he was undergoing ketamine infusion therapy for depression and anxiety. Matthew Perry's death was initially ruled accidental, with no signs of foul play suspected at first.
Reporting from Los Angeles, Christina Corona, NTD News.
President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris speak in Maryland about a new agreement to reduce prescription drug costs. NTD's Jason Blair has the latest from the Biden-Harris administration.
The big topic today was lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Joe Biden announced a new agreement between Medicare and drug manufacturers to lower the cost of 10 prescription drugs by 2026, with more to follow after that.
Too many Americans can't afford the drugs they badly need for life and death. So they skip doses, cut pills in half, forego prescriptions entirely because the prescription drugs are totally unaffordable.
He said this is the first of its kind in history, and he credits the Inflation Reduction Act for making it possible. It was touted that Harris cast the tie-breaking vote back when she was a senator in order for the act to pass. Tomorrow, Harris is scheduled to be in North Carolina. She is expected to lay out the details of her economic policy. It looks like at least one vice presidential debate has been scheduled for October 1st on CBS. Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance also proposed September 18th to Harris's running mate Tim Walz as well. Walz has yet to formally respond. And Harris and Trump are scheduled to debate on September 10th, and both candidates have expressed interest in talking about a possible future second debate after that. Reporting in Prince George's County, Maryland, Jason Blair, NTD News.
And in her speech tomorrow, Harris is expected to call for a federal ban on price gouging to help lower grocery prices. The proposal is part of her efforts to stop corporations in the food and grocery industries from hiking up prices. And independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has responded to multiple reports suggesting he would endorse Harris. Multiple media outlets reported that RFK Jr. requested a meeting with Harris to discuss serving in her administration. The report cited Kennedy campaign officials. They reportedly said if Kennedy supported Harris and she won, Kennedy would get a position in her administration. Kennedy wrote a long post on X today saying, quote, "I have no plans to endorse Kamala Harris for president. I do have a plan to defeat her." He said he cannot support the Democratic Party due to its differences with the party of his father and uncle. He added he believes today's Democrats are aligned with big tech, big pharma, and Wall Street. Former President Trump held a press conference at his golf club in New Jersey, which wrapped up just moments ago. It comes as he's laying out his economic agenda before Vice President Kamala Harris announces hers. Joining us now live is NTD's Iris Tao, who is in Bedminster, New Jersey. Iris, good evening. What did you have from this event tonight?
This argument that he has made consistently and that Democrats are responsible for.
Good evening to you. So right here at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey, former President Trump held a very lengthy press conference, giving lengthy responses to almost each and every question, talking about mainly the economy and, of course, his take on the current state of the election. As you can see right behind us, the table is filled with different grocery items, food items like milk, cereal, and bagel, different items that he's trying to show how inflation has impacted everyday American people's lives. And here's a thought of him talking about inflation inflation in the country. Watch.
Young people are being devastated by what they've done to our country. Grocery prices have skyrocketed. Cereals are up 26%. Bread is up 24%. Butter is up 37%. Baby formula is up 30%. Flour is up 38%. And eggs are up 46%. And many items are up at much higher rates than that.
And Trump also talked about the status of the U.S. in the world, especially given the wars going on, of course, in the Middle East and also in Europe. He also talked about how the U.S. needs to exert its strength and to bring success in order to unite Americans. He also talked about fighting China and Russia, countering their influence, and asked former President Trump how specifically he will counter China and hold it accountable, as he said the COVID from China that brought the COVID to the entire world was a fence too far. Watch.
And yes, I've seen you around a little bit, so go ahead, please.
Mr. President, thank you for doing this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So you talked about how COVID from China was a fence too far. What's your plan for holding China accountable if you get reelected?
Well, I want to get along with China. I had a great relationship with President Xi. We made a fantastic trade deal, $50 billion of farm products and manufacturing products they had to buy here, and they were adhering to it. They don't adhere to it anymore because they don't respect Harris or Biden. And I hope we're going to have a great relationship. But it's got to be a fair relationship. China was taking...
And as he was ending his press conference, I also asked him what he's going to do during the Democratic National Convention next week in Chicago. He told me he's going to just watch, telling me that it's going to be disastrous. We know that Vice President Kamala Harris will be laying out her economic vision for the country tomorrow in Raleigh, North Carolina. And Trump yesterday already gave a speech on the economy, also in the battleground state of North Carolina. So expect the economy to be really at the top of the agenda for both candidates in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, we're also expecting Trump to do more next week as he responds and to Kamala Harris's talking points during the Democratic National Convention. Back to you.
Iris, thanks for those updates. And an update on Trump's New York criminal case. His attorneys are asking the judge to postpone sentencing until after the presidential election in November. Trump was convicted in May of 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. He is currently scheduled to be sentenced on September 18th. In a letter made public today, Trump's lawyer suggested that sentencing Trump as scheduled would amount to election interference. The lawyer wrote that a delay would also allow Trump time to weigh next steps, such as an appeal. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Columbia University's president has resigned. Minouche Shafik announced her resignation last night in a memo sent to the Columbia community. Shafik was one of the university leaders called before Congress earlier this year. She's now the third president of an Ivy League school to step down over campus protests of the Israel-Hamas war. Student protesters have vowed to resume protests when the fall semester starts in a few weeks. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has Shafik's reason for resigning and some reactions.
My name is Minouche Shafik.
Columbia University President Minouche Shafik stated she made the decision to resign now, so new leadership could be in place for the new term starting in a few weeks. Shafik is an economist born in Egypt and held senior positions at the World Bank. She's worked at the International Monetary Fund and the Bank of England, and is former president of the London School of Economics. She began her role at Columbia as president in July last year. Scrutiny of Shafik peaked in April, when New York police arrested about 300 pro-Gaza protesters. That's after some demonstrators barricaded themselves inside a university building. Shafik also came under criticism for her testimony to the House Education Committee over the university's handling of anti-Semitism. Shafik, in a resignation letter, wrote she tried to navigate a path that upholds academic principles and treats everyone with fairness and compassion. She says it has been distressing to find herself, colleagues, and students as the subject of threats and abuse. The Ivy League listed Katrina Armstrong as interim president on the university's website. Armstrong is a medical doctor and serves as CEO of the medical campus. She was also executive vice president for the Health and Biomedical Sciences Department at Columbia. The Columbia Board of Trustees in a letter stated it regretfully accepted Shafik's resignation, praising her contributions to the university's community. The board went on to endorse Armstrong, saying her leadership and experience will help the school with its challenges. Armstrong says she is deeply honored to start her new role, roughly 3 weeks before the fall semester starts. She wrote she is acutely aware of the trials the university has faced over the past year. Shafik says she'll be working with Armstrong to ensure an orderly transition. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
Earlier, we spoke with William Jacobson, law professor at Cornell University and founder of the Equal Protection Project, about Shafik's resignation. William Jacobson, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, to begin, what is your reaction to Shafik resigning, and how likely are we to see other university presidents follow suit?
Well, we've already seen several of them, and I think that it's the schools that are in the hot seat, the schools where there's a lot of trouble and where there's congressional scrutiny and political scrutiny. So I wasn't shocked she resigned. She performed very poorly when she appeared before Congress. Columbia has been a complete disaster as a campus, very aggressive protests, and she didn't seem to know how to deal with them. So it's not at all shocking that she's bowing out. Same thing happened at Cornell, where I teach. That president didn't have the congressional problem, but bowed out. I don't think she could handle it.
And on that note, what is your assessment on how these universities handled anti-Semitism on campuses in the wake of these pro-Palestinian protests?
They didn't really know how to deal with it. I think they were unprepared for it. I think ideologically, they have thrown in essentially with the Palestinian cause, and they didn't realize what the impact would be on campuses. And of course, we know in UCLA, a judge just ordered the UCLA campus to not allow protesters to bar Zionists and Jews from areas of campus. So I think the administrations have been an abject failure. They should have seen this coming, but apparently they didn't.
In terms of protests, what can we expect to see on college campuses this fall?
I think it's going to be what happened last year, but on steroids. I think that what we're going to see at the DNC in Chicago, those very aggressive protests, bordering on riots, are going to happen on campuses. I think a lot of the students that I'm observing, the anti-Israel students, who are also in many ways the anti-American students, are extremely frustrated. They built their encampments, they built their tent cities, and it had virtually no impact on any of the campuses. Yes, it did intimidate a bunch of people, and it did cause legal problems for the schools, but no schools have really changed their policies. None of these schools are boycotting Israel, and so I think they're frustrated, and I think that frustration is going to play out in more aggressive protests and potentially violence this fall.
On that intimidation note, in your view, what will it take for Jewish students to feel safe on college campuses and go to classes?
Well, I think it's going to be enforcing the rules equally as to everybody. I don't think Jewish students or any other group of students are entitled to any special treatment. But when you have rules on campus, for example, at Cornell, that prohibit the use of bullhorns inside academic buildings, they should enforce those rules. And they didn't at Cornell, and same with Columbia, and same with other places. If you have rules that you can't set up an encampment, those should be enforced. They should be enforced neutrally. They should be enforced against everybody. So I think what's going to change the situation on the campuses is if the schools start actually enforcing the rules that they already have, which prohibit these sort of intimidation tactics.
On that last part, what do you think is at the root problem of how universities have been handling it? We've been hearing from some sides saying that, the root causes is Marxism, but what's your view on this?
Well, I think, as somebody who's been on a campus for 17 years and who studied this problem for 30 years, I think that the campuses ideologically have been captured. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it critical race theory. You can call it anti-colonial theory. You can call it diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a lot of names that get put on it, but at its core, it's a group identity ideology that has captured the campuses more so than any place else. And so everybody is pigeonholed into a group. You're white, you're Asian, you're black, you're Hispanic, you're mixed race, whatever it is. And that inevitably will lead to balkanization of the campus, and inevitably will lead to conflict, and inevitably will lead to the dominant party on campus, which is the left, exerting their political power on a group ideology basis. And that's many ways why Jews have been cast aside on campuses, because they're portrayed as white oppressors, which of course is untrue, but that fits into the whole ideology. So I would chalk it up to ideological capture by group identity ideology on the campuses.
William Jacobson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
The FTC is ramping up its fight against fake online reviews. It will now directly enforce a ban against anyone who breaks its new rules. Here's the story.
The FTC has announced final rules on fake reviews as it ramps up efforts to stop them. The rules prohibit buying reviews, insider reviews, reviewer suppression, and buying fake social media followers.
It's great because there's so many people that were playing games.
Phil Masiello teaches people how to grow online businesses. He says fake negative reviews have been a problem for his clients.
We get redirected from growing businesses to having to combat all this negative stuff and get it taken off, spending time communicating with Google, spending time communicating with Amazon, taking screenshots and doing all that. I mean, it's weeks and weeks and weeks worth of work.
FTC Chair Lena Khan says that fake reviews not only waste people's time and money, they divert business away from honest competitors. Her new rules allow the FTC to directly seek civil penalties against violators. In the past, it would have gone through the Justice Department. Perpetrators will be fined for every fake review, which means the fines could really stack up. Online review sites praised the news.
I'm very much glad and happy that FTC finally made the ruling to ban fake reviews.
Podolsky runs a website where consumers can comment on businesses. He expects fewer fake reviews on his site after this news.
We, as a company, have built instruments to try to weed them out electronically, as well as through human moderation. We do everything possible in our power to remove that fake component.
Podolsky says he's glad the government is also stepping in to fight the fake reviews. He's worked with the FTC in the past, giving them data such as names, emails, and numbers when it was investigating fake reviews. And he's happy to help the commission going forward.
China remains America's most consequential strategic competitor now and in the coming decades. Navigating a stable relationship against mounting threats has been a top priority for the Biden administration. NTD's Arlene Richards reviews the presidential candidate's approaches to trade and manufacturing in the U.S.-China relationship.
China, it's still the biggest threat to the United States.
No country presents a broader, more severe threat to our ideas, our innovation, our economic security than China.
With a rapidly growing military, China has the power to reshape the international order to its liking.
When I talk about the threat posed by China, I mean the government of China, in particular led by the CCP.
Despite the challenges, managing the U.S.'s relationship with one of its powerful rivals has become a top foreign policy priority. But where do the presidential candidates stand on some of the issues involved? Trade and manufacturing. Former President Trump historically has been tough on China. During his presidency, the Trump administration issued 8 executive orders that primarily involved China. Topics ranged from human rights abuse to blocking the financing of communist Chinese military companies. An additional 7 orders affected key policy areas involving China, such as trade and manufacturing and threats to the domestic supply chain. Under those orders, Trump sought to expand trade in a way that would make it freer and fairer for all Americans, and eliminate the free trade practice. From the beginning of his presidency, Trump called for tighter trade practices, eventually launching a trade war with China. He imposed tariffs ranging from 10 to 25% on over $300 billion of Chinese goods. These moves were intended to stop China's unfair practice of forcing businesses to share their intellectual property secrets. Trump vows to continue this practice if he is reelected. He's now proposing a 10% across-the-board tariff on all U.S. imports, as well as a 60% tariff on imports from China.
By phasing in tariffs and restrictions, we will phase out imports of all essential goods from China.
And Trump makes another promise.
And we will bring those jobs and factories back to South Carolina and our other great states.
According to the White House archives, Trump's policy created more than 1.2 million manufacturing and construction jobs. Despite these achievements, the United Auto Workers Union has endorsed Kamala Harris. During her 2020 run for president, Harris walked the picket line with striking auto workers. Her promises to the union have not focused on trade deals with China, but rather on speaking out against the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which replaced NAFTA, a long-standing agreement that had eliminated tariffs on merchandise. The revised USMCA agreement eliminated free trade and created more balanced reciprocal trade supporting high-paying jobs for Americans. As senator, Harris opposed the revision, saying it failed on the climate crisis. Harris hasn't commented about trade with China in recent campaign stops, but she argued against Trump's tariffs in her 2020 vice presidential debate with Mike Pence.
Now, on the issue of jobs, Senator Harris, let's talk about that. The vice president earlier referred to, as part of what he thinks is an accomplishment, the president's trade war with China. You lost that trade war.
She said the trade war caused a manufacturing recession. According to an April 2020 report by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate in 2019 fell to its lowest level in 50 years at 3.5%. As vice president, Harris has supported Biden's policies on China. During the 2020 presidential race, Biden criticized Trump's tariffs on China, saying in an ex post that Trump didn't know basic economics and that the tariffs were being paid by the American people. But he kept the tariffs in place. In May, Biden announced new tariffs on $18 billion of China's imports to combat unfair competition against American workers.
For years, the Chinese government has poured state money into Chinese companies across a whole range of industries.
It's not clear whether or not Harris will continue the tariffs. But in 2019, prior to becoming vice president, she said she is not a protectionist Democrat and opposed widespread tariffs. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
And let's turn our attention to the Philippines, where tensions are simmering with communist China. The U.S. is sending an unprecedented level of military support to the island nation. Earlier, we spoke with retired Navy Captain Brent Sadler about the importance of the Philippines to the U.S. and China's other military activities in the Indo-Pacific. Sadler is a former Pentagon official and a research fellow for naval warfare at the Heritage Foundation. Brent Sadler, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, there's an increasing focus on the Philippines, especially with tensions simmering with China. Now, the Foreign Policy recently had a piece saying, quote, the Philippines is Washington's new front line against China. Now, besides the mutual defense treaty between the two countries, how important is the Philippines to the U.S.?
Well, for several reasons. On the economic front, the Filipinos are a large portion of the merchant mariners in which the United States relies for conduct of its trade. But more directly, the gift of geography places the Philippines right on the front line in this great power competition with China. During the Cold War, it was a bulwark against communist China's expansion, but also Soviet designs in Southeast Asia. Today, yet again, because of that geography, it sits at a very important place to push back on communist China's designs in Southeast Asia again, but also should a war break out over the future of Taiwan, the Chinese know they need to control the waters in and around the Philippines to be successful, and thus the success or failure of any American war effort in the region.
And zooming out a bit with the tensions we are seeing in Asia and the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East as well as in Europe, how likely are we to see the U.S. involved in a three-front war, either directly or through proxies?
Well, I think we're already seeing, sadly, some of the contours of that unfolding right now. Russia's invasion in 2022 of Ukraine really pushed very close to a more direct confrontation, but we are very much involved with NATO countries in Europe to provide huge amounts of munitions and a lot of diplomatic activity and a lot of attention of senior leadership in D.C. So that has a cost and bandwidth, intellectual bandwidth. In the Middle East, you've got, since October of last year, Iran that has stoked many confrontations across the region, the most direct to U.S. interest being the Houthis attacking shipping and U.S. naval vessels for several months now. And of course, our longstanding ally in Israel's constant threat from Hezbollah the war since October from Hamas and Iran directly, which we saw in April. And really, the only shoe that hasn't fallen is a more direct, violent confrontation in Asia, though we did see the beginnings of something like that just a couple months ago when the Chinese and the Philippines maritime forces had a violent confrontation at Second Thomas Shoal.
We are seeing China and Russia with their no limits partnership, but they're also training their militaries together. We saw recently patrols by Alaska, Taiwan, and Japan. What do you make of those joint patrols?
Well, it's a troubling development. It's not one, a few years back I would have said that it's very unlikely given the inherent animosities and historical grievances between Moscow and Beijing. But that being said, there was a watershed event where both Russia and China used nuclear-capable bombers to fly around Takshima Dokdo Island. It's disputed between South Korea and Japan back in July of 2019. And that signaled a real change that now, quite frankly, combined Russian-Chinese naval flotillas sailing around Japan up into our waters near Alaska, as well as flying their nuclear-capable bombers repeatedly around Japan and more distantly into the Philippine Sea. It's become a routine occurrence, and it highlights not just a passing strategic partnership, but one that actually goes to a higher level of coordination and pre-planning.
Now, on the economic front, the South China Morning Post is reporting that local authorities inside China and across China are in talks about how to do more business with Russia while evading Western sanctions. Now, where do you see all of this going, especially in regards to this military development?
Well, Communist China, as well as the Soviet Union and now Russia, are all very familiar with and have in the past used barter exchange. North Korea, Cuba also have benefited, during the most chaotic times of the post-Soviet era, where they actually exchanged, in the case of Cuba, rum and cigars for financial assistance from the Soviet Union and also trade in goods. And so this is not a new development, but it's very limited in its capacity and the things you can actually move. What's more likely is after 2014, Moscow and Beijing developed their own alternatives to the SWIFT system. This is the electronic means to do financial transactions. And all you need is one bank and a fiber optic cable or satellite connection between those two banks in your capitals to make and conduct financial transactions. And my suspicion since 2014, when those two systems came online to evade sanctions after Russia annexed Crimea, have been utilized and continue to be utilized. And there's not much that the West can do about it or can see into the activities that they're doing.
Brent Sadler, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Two House lawmakers today urging a probe into cybersecurity risks posed by Chinese-made Wi-Fi routers. The congressmen are specifically targeting a company called TP-Link Technology and its affiliates. The request came from Chairman of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, John Molinar, and the committee's ranking member, Raja Krishnamurti. In a letter to the Commerce Department, they cited instances of TP-Link routers being used to target officials in European countries. The lawmakers also described known vulnerabilities in the products that could be exploited for criminal purposes. Last year, the U.S. disclosed a Chinese state-backed hacking campaign called Volt Typhoon. Officials said the operation sought to compromise critical American infrastructure by seizing control of hundreds of office routers. The Commerce Department said it would respond to the letter through appropriate channels. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In France, people are celebrating August 15th, one of the most important traditional holidays in the country. This tradition dates back to the miraculous birth of one of France's most famous kings, Louis XIV. NTD's international correspondent David Vives has the story.
August 15th has long been a national holiday in France. The day marks the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. In France, this day is celebrated with religious parades and events in churches.
Today we have many processions in France, all over France. It's kind of renewal, but there are many processions. And today in Paris, we will make a procession also going through the center of Paris.
The origins of this celebration trace back to what was considered a miracle in France's history. In the 17th century, King Louis XIII and his Queen Anne of Austria were unable to have a son for 22 years. The king then made a special vow to the Virgin Mary.
The demand of the king to the Virgin Mary, to her intercession, was to get a son, because, as you know, by a kingdom, a king needs a son. So, and this was not coming. So that's why he made this special vow. He dedicated all his kingdom to the Virgin Mary.
The king commanded the kingdom to participate in a series of processions and prayers. Exactly 9 months after the processions ended, the queen gave birth to a son, who later became Louis XIV, the most famous king of France. That was when the old king swore an oath to dedicate the French kingdom to the Virgin Mary and to make August 15th a special day.
These different vows are intricated the history of France with the faith. What would be sent by God, we don't know, but we can just hope that more and more we can be near to heaven.
King Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, ruled over France for over 72 years. He is remembered as a warrior who fought to restore peace and a patron of the arts. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.